Hello everyone, welcome to our latest Novedge webinar episode. This week, Rapid 3D Fabrication with Vectorworks Subdivision Modeling. Vectorworks 2016 has introduced a new and powerful tool called Subdivision Modeling. And this tool allows anyone to quickly model seemingly complicated 3D organic forms in a digital interface at scale. The Power Vectorworks platform allows for easy export to fabrication-ready file formats. This session is designed to introduce you to the concept of subdivision modeling and the options available to bring your concept into the tangible world at any scale. Today's presenter, Jacob Dale, is founder, creative director, and BIM expert at Tangibly.com. Tangibly is a resource to designers and creative studios who are looking to maximize their use of design software through skills workshops, training, and consulting. What a great tool. Before we get going, here's an overview of what we do in Novedge. Novedge is one of the largest online stores for design software, and we offer a huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's need. Put us to the test and come visit our webpage at novedge.com. And for more daily software news and limited time promotions, pay a visit to the Novedge blog, follow us on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. Coming up next week, from 2D drawing to BIM, with Vectorworks and Jonathan Pickup, so another great Vectorworks webinar. Last but not least, today's webinar is free and is being recorded, so if you want to rewatch it, just head on over to Novedge's YouTube and Vimeo channel as early as this afternoon. Now, without further ado, I will pass the screen to Jacob, and he will start this great presentation. Thank you, Jacob, for your patience.
Thank you, Barbara. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me from around the world. I've actually used Novedge as a resource for many years. I watched a lot of webinars that they offer, and so now it's an honor to actually share what I know about Vectorworks, what I'm still learning about Vectorworks here on this platform. So thank you again, Barbara, for inviting me as a guest today. So if you are looking for any resources for training or consulting, that is what we do at Tangibly. I have been using Vectorworks for 16 years plus in a variety of professional facets, but it's really my obsession to use this software, and I tinker with it daily on the weekends and work with it professionally with other professionals every day. So keep us in mind if you're looking to boost your skills. What we're going to talk about today is a new tool called the Subdivision Modeling tool. Came out in 2016 with Vectorworks. I did a previous webinar about a month ago hosted by Vectorworks where we broke down the individual tools of the Subdivision Modeling tool and really got into the nitty-gritty of just how to use every facet of it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time getting into those details today. What we're going to do is more of a hands-on exploration, and what I'd like to do is create something that is of use to myself. I'm a very active person in the outdoors. I like snow sports and I like water sports. So I come home often with wet boots when I get back to the cabin, or wet swimsuits, etc. And I'm always looking for a place to sit down and take my shoes off. And my partner, she's always complaining that I'm sitting with my wet clothes on furniture. So I'm looking for a solution. I'd like something a little bit more than just a box to sit on when I take off my wet gear, and I'd like a place to store my boots. And so what we're going to talk about today in a relatively brief period is creating a small boot bench. So a bench that one could sit on, we could stow some boots underneath it, and it actually has some space where the water could seep through as the snow melts. So you could choose to put this in your mudroom, just inside your front door, or out on the patio of your cabin. So if you learn anything cool, obviously you don't have to make the bench directly, but this is a real-world example, and given the fact this is a relatively new tool, a lot of us have kind of been seeking a way to make the most use out of this tool. So what does that bench look like? I was inspired by a tractor seat, very simple, functional, has a nice organic curve to it, and also has some holes in it to let moisture or air flow through it. Well, contemporarily, our tools have had some 3D modeling capability, but really just within the last couple of years, we've started to see tools that have the ability to model such organic shapes as you see there. Now, this tractor seat was likely traditionally formed by hand, and then a mold was made of it and then manufactured into many parts, or many duplications. Well, I was also inspired by my breakfast a few weeks ago, and I was thinking, well, the cells in the waffle actually will allow the syrup to, in this circumstance, catch, but if the cells were completely open, then the fluid would run straight through and you still have your grid or your framework of your object. So what I'm going to show you next is kind of an end result of sorts of a model within Vectorworks that I used the Subdivision Modeling tool to come about. We used a couple of other tools, and we're going to go through of that. And I've actually recorded my process of creating this and sped it up a little bit because I want to show you some of the mistakes that I've made along the way, backed up and fixed those, how I fixed those, and then we can talk about some ways that you might approach this in your particular projects. Why am I showing you my mistakes? Well, on this particular tool, I will not claim to be an expert. It's a very new tool. It's only really been available in Vectorworks for about 9 months. But what I'm excited about is there are a lot of improvements to this tool that are coming up in the next edition of Vectorworks 2017, and you should look for an update on your software if you're a subscriber. That's probably mid-September is when that will be released. A lot of new features, and we can talk about that later, the new additional features to the Subdivision tool. So what I'm looking for here is my model of Vectorworks. And I see here in Vectorworks I have a model called Boot Bench. And this is a 3D model that I've created with the Subdivision tool predominantly. And I'll go ahead and just use the Orbit tool, and we can spin around this particular object. And you'll notice that much like the waffle pattern, I've created this grid in this object, but you also see a nice curved organic shape similar to that tractor seat. And that allows a nice comfortable place to sit while you take off your boots or your other active gear, and then you have a space underneath to stow your boots or other shoes or jacket, whatever it be. So a nice simple project, and let's go ahead and we're going to look at the process of creating this from the beginning. And like I said, this is going to be a little bit more of a sped up version, but we'll get a few chances, especially the brief breaks where I had to think about the process and maybe correct my actions, and we'll talk about that as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and play that video, and then I'll just kind of voice over as we go through it. So what I started with here in Vectorworks was a constraint. So as you'll notice on the lower right-hand corner, we have the navigation palette, and I have my design layer set up. And I've created a cube of constraints that is essentially the maximum dimensions that I want for this bench. So the approximate dimensions, if I remember correctly, are about 26 inches wide, about 18 inches deep, and about 18 inches tall. So nice compact bench to put just inside your bedroom. Well, I created a rectangle and then extruded that into a block to create those constraints. Well, what you'll notice also is I have two different design layers referred to as panels X and panels Y. Because when I started with this project, I had the intention of slicing this object into many different panels that I could theoretically cut out of a piece of plywood with a jigsaw, or even take that file, send it to CAD, and put it to a CNC router and have the pieces cut for me at a fabrication plant. So what we'll see here is my process of creating those particular, the fins that will divide my subdivision object. Now, I haven't used this particular method in a little while, so I did a couple of mess ups here as far as the duplication goes, and I'll just go ahead and fast forward through that because it's not really necessary to walk through that relatively simple process. But essentially what I wanted to show you is we have that constraints and that constraints volume, and then what I've created is all of those dividing panels that go within that constraining box. And so those are essentially rectangles that have been extruded into extrudes, and it creates this waffle pattern. Well, given it's just a rectilinear shape, it's not that interesting. You could essentially just sit on a milk crate if you want to, and that's not really what this is about. This is about having a little bit more fun with the shape and creating a little more design there. So what you'll see here now is I've activated the subdivision modeling tool. I'm going to pause here for a second just in case you missed that. And if we look here down to the lower left of Vectorworks panel, I have all of my tool sets there, and I've clicked on the 3D modeling tool set, and I double clicked on the Edit Subdivision Modeling tool. You'll find that down here. It's the 6th one in the list, and you actually have to double click on this tool in order for it to activate. The first few times I tried to use this when it was in beta phase this time last year, I would click on it once and nothing would happen, and so I just thought, well, that'll come in the next update. But I soon understood that you have to double click on it to come up with this dialog box that you see here. Well, I selected a sphere from the drop-down menu, and when you park a subdivision object into your design layer, it places it at your 0, 0 origin. Well, the grid that I had created previously had started at at the 0, 0, so I have to actually move that sphere to the center point of the grid that I've created. So what I'm also checking here is that it's on the same horizon. Well, also notice that when you create subdivision objects, its insertion point is also at the 0 as far as the Z goes. That means that half of your object, if it's a subdivision object, actually appears below your horizon. So if you want your objects that are created through a 2D to 3D process to align with the objects you've created with subdivision, go ahead and check those in your front view and make sure everything's on orthogonal so that everything aligns nice and neat. So what you'll see now is that I've actually got my design layered. I can show you here with my cursor over the top of the screen. Over on the right-hand side on the navigation, I have my design layers set to gray snap others. And I have that set that way so that I can get a sense of where this subdivision primitive, as it's referred to, that sphere there, is parked in relation to the constraints that I've created. Well, I'm using the 3D dragger tool up at the top. When I select the subdivision modeling tool, the first setting there gives me the ability to actually manipulate the faces, edges, and points of the cage. And the cage essentially will affect the primitive inside as you move the cage. And you'll see me moving the faces of the cage there with the 3D dragger. Now the 3D dragger is available when you click on this first mode of the subdivision tool. Then the 3D dragger tool is just here to the right-hand side, just to the right of that pipe there. And what that is essentially an axis of X, Y, and Z. It gives you a point. You can click on that little blue point and move the whole face basically in any direction, X, Y, or Z. Well, the arrows on that 3D dragger are specific to the exact X, Y, or Z axes. So if you click on those arrows and drag them, then they'll move only in accordance to those axes. Well, you may have noticed the arc, and we'll see the 3D dragger again here in a moment, but the arcs connecting those axes, that's essentially gives you the ability to rotate the face, edge, or point by clicking on that arc and dragging it from left to right, or using the tab key to enter an exact angle as you prefer. So what I've moved on to here is I'm beginning to split the edges of my cage. And you'll notice when I split the edges of the cage, it gives me a lot more articulation of the primitive within the cage. So it allows me to bring that curved edge of the sphere closer to the face of the cage, effectively giving more of a rounded cube as we see there. Well, the closer that I bring that edge to the outside face of the cage, the tighter that curve becomes. So what we're starting to see take shape is the overall curved volume of this small bench that I had conceived of. Well, if you're looking to get to the split edge mode, that is actually up at, if you'll notice my cursor up at the top, I notice it's cut off just a little bit, but work with me here. We'll see that the split edge is there at the very end of the line of these initial modes of the Edit Subdivision tool. So I'm continuing to split the edges, but what I'm doing is trying to be very regimented about how I split these. And you'll notice that when I click on that edge to split, I didn't mean to split on that edge there. You can always hit escape to just back up. You're still in the Edit Subdivision tool. If you hit escape, it just backs up one command. Well, as I'm splitting those edges, I'm splitting them by 50% exactly. And I essentially start with the one edge, split it by 50%, and then work my way inwards from the other splits. I'm not aware of a way to split any of the edges by any multiples at this point, but that may be coming in the next version, or I just may not be aware of it currently. So you'll see that I've divided this cage into a lot more permutations to give me much finer control over that particular object. Well, what I'm doing now is taking the Crease mode, and that's the second mode of the Edit Subdivision tool. And I'm actually using the Crease mode on those individual faces that I've created. Now, you have to be careful that you'll notice there that I can actually select edges or points that are back behind the object. So you have to be really careful that when you're selecting those faces that you get all of those edges highlighting. That essentially means that you're selecting the face and not an edge. You'll see there all four edges are highlighting. And what I'm doing is I'm clicking around the object and flattening that face right up to the cage. So that creases the face up to the cage. And then another thing is I can click on those edges and crease those edges right up to the cage as well. Well, why am I doing this in particular? I imagine that there might be a little bit more stability to my bench if it didn't have a rounded edge on the bottom, especially when I have all my clunky outdoor gear on. It might be nice to have a stable foundation to this particular bench. So I'm working my way around that object and essentially just creasing the bottom half of that particular object. And you'll notice that I come back to the corner and actually click on that outside edge of the cage and effectively decrease that edge so that it rounds the edge of the object, giving it a nice flowing form. So as I look in top plan mode, you'll see that what we saw there briefly, that really tight grid pattern is actually the primitive. That is the wireframe of our subdivision primitive that is giving us all of the articulation of this curve shape. And there we see it again. So what I've done is I've named my primitive bench in this organization of design layers. And then I have my design layers of panel Y and panels X. And then I'm showing all three of those right now just to show you how those particular panels are going to interact with this relatively curved form here. And I'm going to go ahead and speed up here a little bit. What I'm going to do now is actually take this, now that I have a primitive object here, what I want to do is create multiple viewports of this object. And I've created a sheet and placed viewports of this object in different angles so that I have a good understanding of the object that I'm looking to fabricate. And here you'll see that I'm actually manipulating some of the visibilities of those viewports to get a little bit more of the graphic style that I'm looking for and also show the particular design layers that are important to me. Well, there's a little bit of a challenge here in trying to output information to, say, a template or a CNC router or something like that where we're just creating these small panels. Well, the solution that I came up with was to actually draw section lines through the object at every supposed panel and that would give me a viewport for every panel in the X and Y axes. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up through this. We don't necessarily have to watch me draw section lines through every single one. If you've got more questions regarding doing section lines over plans, just let me know, and I'll fill you in later. But I'm going to go ahead and fast forward here, and you can essentially see what I'm doing is just taking that top plan viewport, and then I create a section. There's the section that we see. Well, there's not a lot of information in that section currently because we're actually taking a section of a rectilinear object, and it's not showing the primitive in it currently based on the viewport pattern. So we'll see now that I have actually some section lines through most of the object, and I don't want to show you too much too early, but there we go. We have all our section windows, and then I go and sort them out and then make them nice and neat. Well, I'm going back to the model here, and I'm looking at what I've created thus far, and I'm thinking that I actually want to create a seat, and I jumped ahead a little bit too much there. I want to show you how I selected those points. So if you'll notice, I just moved to the first mode of the subdivision tool, and I'm using the 3D dragger to actually, rather than pick a face or an edge, I'm actually picking points along the seat of this bench. And what I want to do is create a little bit of a slope into the bench so it's a nice resting seat and it's not just a hard flat surface. And what I'm doing is selecting all of the points on the grid that I actually want to move. Now I'm going to grab all these points. How I'm grabbing them many multiples at a time is actually holding shift as I select those points. Even though the 3D dragger is moving along as I select them, those points are actually selected. Now there's a little bit of a visibility issue here. If you're experiencing what you see there on the screen where you can't quite see through to the cage, I have actually discovered a little bit later in this demo that, there you go, as you zoom in, you have the ability to have that visibility on those points. Now that's something I just discovered, and there you go. So there's a little trick for you, and maybe that'll be resolved in the new update to the software. But you'll notice as I zoom out and zoom in, the visibilities of those points and edges change a little bit. So just pay attention to that. Another thing that, again, I just want to reiterate, I'm being really careful to select just the points and not the edges and faces beyond. And there is that ability to do that because, as you notice, that object is a little bit translucent. And when you're in this edit phase, you can actually accidentally pick a point or an edge or a face that is beyond the surface that you were intending. And that could get a little bit messy. If you, say, select a grid like I've done here, and you decide to rotate it, well, other points and surfaces elsewhere in the object might be rotating. You might not be aware of it. Well, that compounds a lot in the future if you're looking to clean up your messes. So back to what's actually happening here on the screen is I selected all of those points, and I am rotating them at a particular angle. And I decided that through just kind of pulling it back and forth that 10 degrees might be a great angle for that seat. And so I just basically hit tab and went into the heads up data bar there and just typed in 10 degrees and hit enter. Well, those points are still selected. Once you hit enter, it rotates them on an angle, but you still have the ability to manipulate them in other directions. Well, you'll notice here that I'm contemplating moving those points down even more so we can create a little bit of a leg well or a depression on the front edge of the bench. But I had a little bit of foresight, and I did not select that center point there. You'll notice that one of those points was not selected. And I actually did that before I even angled any of the points previously. So we have a little bit of a shape, much like the tractor seat that I had shown just a little bit prior. So as I move those down, all of the other points stay stationary, and so we get this depression of points, and therefore it affects the primitive. So I'm messing with the visibilities of the design layers a little bit. I'm probably thinking about what to do next. I think that the overall shape is really starting to be apparent now. And what I can do is start to manipulate individual points, edges, or faces to just add a little bit more style, articulation, or desired effect with this particular object. Well, you'll notice that I've decided there that those little corners are a little bit harsh, and I can grab that one point, and you'll notice as I drag that one point that it has this nice smoothing effect. Well, it's going to have that effect unless I were to use the Crease Mode. If I click on that point with the Crease Mode, then it actually makes a sharp point because it pulls that primitive up to the point on the cage. Well, as I move those points up, I get this nice kind of smooth shape, more organic shape to the seat, and we'll add a little bit more articulation to that as well with the 3D dragger. So again, I'm being a little regimented with the distances that I'm dragging these points and using increments of an inch or 2 inches as you've seen there. And again, I'm just using the heads-up data bar to just enter that information directly. One other thing you may be noticing when I move the 3D dragger with these particular parts selected is the fact that the object seems to jump a lot. It has kind of this hopping effect, and it's not really smooth. That is an effect of the snapping palette. Now, when you're using the Subdivision Modeling tool, you can turn off all of your snaps. That is an option. But there's two different methods there. If you're going to use constraints, as I've done in creating kind of this constraining object that I want my object to fit within, you may actually want your snaps to be active. Well, if you're just creating something freeform that really doesn't have constraints and it's just more of a conceptual idea, then you could essentially turn off all your snaps. Well, how I'm affecting the snaps on the fly is actually using the tilde key, which is just below, or it's also known as the accent key, just below the escape key on your keyboard. And that temporarily disables snaps in Vectorworks, no matter what workflow you're working with. And that allows me to have more of a free-form, nice smooth movement of the 3D dragger tool. That does help a lot in subdivision modeling because, as you've seen in some of these methods, the shape can kind of get out of hand pretty quickly, especially if your 3D dragger snaps to a point on the opposite side of the shape. You kind of get these inverted shapes. There's an example right there. So what I'm doing on the front edge of that seat is just continuing to smooth out the articulation of the seat. And I'm using just selecting multiple points, and notice that you don't have to select all points in succession. You can actually skip a few points, and we'll see here that we've created just a nice smooth seat within the bench. And how I'm rotating around this particular object is using the orbit tool, and we'll see that here in the basic tool palette, and just click on that orbit tool or use the command Shift-C to orbit around it. Now here's something to keep in mind when you are using the orbit tool to fly around a particular object, is it does deactivate the Edit Subdivision tool and requires you to go back into the tool or double-click into your primitive object in order to edit it again. Now there are some tools available out there on the market. I know that Novedge does supply some of these as well. They're 3D orbit extra like Space Mouse peripherals that you can use, and those do allow you to rotate around those objects on the fly. Now I wasn't using that in this particular demonstration, but it would be really helpful, especially the more articulated of organic shapes that you're beginning to create with subdivision modeling. So keep that in mind. And it also is really helpful if you're doing a lot of 3D modeling in general, even if it's rectilinear 3D modeling, like doing sets and stages, lighting, houses, etc. So what I'm doing now is actually planning a void in the object. As we saw when we got started, I wanted to create a void within that shape so that I could place my boots and other gear underneath the seat to make most of the use of my space. I've lived in a couple of cities, and so everything has to have dual function and have storage inside of it. So what I'm doing is creating an object inside that primitive that I want to actually subtract from it in some way. Now, this was my first iteration of that. I had not experimented with it very much up until this point, and this is actually a failed method. So, and the reason why I say it's a failed method is because I'm using just essentially an extruded shape that doesn't really have a lot of organic articulation to it, and it doesn't really go well with what I was designing. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and move forward, and we'll look at some ways that I might back up there. And okay, so this is actually the correction of that, and now I'm using another subdivision object. So I've created a design layer here on the right-hand side. You see I've called it void. So I'm creating the object that's going to inform the void that is going to be subtracted from that original bench form. And the reason why I'm using this subdivision object is because that gives me the ability to give it more nice, smooth, free-form shape that goes along with the bench itself. And so again, I'm using the divide edges command there. There we go, edge split mode, and splitting the edges so that I have more control over that particular object. And we'll see after I've split those edges that I'm actually going to use the crease mode. So I'll go up here and select the crease mode, and then I'm going to deselect those edges to give it a nice round form. And I'm going to do that all the way around on the bottom and the top edge. So just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to bump forward again, and we'll see that the result here is that we have a rounded edge that complements the overall form that I had created previously. And what I want to do is actually subtract that object from that particular form. Now, how does this work? Well, you can't subtract a subdivision object from another subdivision object. And that's really important to note. Currently, in 2016, you cannot subtract a subdivision object from another subdivision object. What you have to do is actually convert your primitive and subdivision object are essentially synonymous, but the primitive is that organic shape you're seeing there. What you have to do is duplicate that object and convert it into a generic solid. And once you create a generic solid out of it, that does give you the ability to do what is referred to as a solid subtraction. So, and that is a one-way street, right? So you saw that notice that came up on the screen there that says you can't undo this. And so what I do is I duplicate the design layer that I've assigned for that particular primitive that I've created, so that I have the ability to come back to that primitive if I want to later in my design process. So I've essentially duplicated the design layer with the primitive on it, or the subdivision object, and converted that into a generic solid for both the bench and also the void. And then that allows me to actually subtract one from the other and create a void on the interior, as we see. And the video is getting a little ahead of me right now, but what I want to explain is what I'm doing now that I've created the void within the object is now setting it up to essentially put it through the cheese grater. So I want to make a waffle out of it, so I want to intersect it with the panels on X axes and panels on Y axes. Now, what's the significance of these particular panels? Their geometry is actually 5/8 inch thick, so I'm actually planning to create this object with 5/8 inch plywood, and so I created those panels with a 5/8 inch thickness. Well, one thing that we notice is I'm actually replacing the panels that I've created. I actually need to get the inverse of those panels so that what goes through the cheese grater is essentially the shape of those 5-inch panels. So I know that might be a little bit confusing, but it'll make a little bit of sense here as we move forward. Essentially what I'm doing is creating a generic solid that that informs the voids that I want to take out of that particular object. So now we are effectively working with generic solids. We're not necessarily working with a subdivision object any longer. And what you'll see here is kind of me trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Well, essentially, you want to simplify this process with the generic solids. Now, what I do in the next step is rather than have a bunch of individual panels that I essentially want to subtract from the subdivision object, I kind of inverted that whole thing and created I took the cube that I created on the constraints design layer and subtracted those panels from it, because that gives me one generic solid together with the inverse of what you're seeing here. We actually will see the ribs instead of the massing. So make a little bit more sense here as I play forward, and I'm selecting the larger object as the generic solid, and we get these larger objects here so that this becomes one generic solid altogether. Well, when we intersect this with the other generic solid that represents the bench, then what we'll get is the panels that actually fill in the space here, rather than, and then these voids are actually taken away. So I'm happy to clarify that a little bit toward the end. Let's just go ahead and move forward a little bit, and we'll see the result of what we're pursuing here. So you'll see now that I've subtracted the solids, and I want to retain the larger object, or the bench, for example, and voila, there we go. We have the divisions or the panels that could be cut to inform this relatively organic shape. And then so effectively I'll do it on the other axes. There's a variety of ways that you could do this. You could change the axes if you'd like to, but I thought this is a pretty basic form to allow any of the moisture that might still be on my snowboard pants, or any of the snow that would be melting from my boots, to actually go through that object and fall down to the ground or the mat or the porch. So what we'll see here is I'm creating the other axes, and there we go. We have 1/2 of our waffle, and then using the layer options there, I'm going to go ahead and show snap others, and there is our final form that we were in pursuit of. We have a really nice little bench. We have some space to store our boots, and we've created this relatively quickly. I know I had this video sped up just a little bit. It's only at 1.25, I believe. So if you have a very basic understanding of the subdivision modeling tool, you have the ability to create truly anything you can imagine. And this is maybe one of the more basic examples of what that could be. So anything from a consumer electronic good or a product of some sort, all the way up to a building, a really nice set design, whatever it be. The world is your oyster. So what I've done is I've selected a live view of the model here that we see, and this is our object that we were in pursuit of. Now you might be asking, okay, well, hold on, this is all about rapid fabrication. How do I fabricate this object? That's a good question. So let me go ahead and head that off just before everybody actually puts that in queue. Well, let's jump to, now that I'm in Vectorworks in the live model, let's jump to the sheets that I've created. And we'll see that I only have a few sheets here in this particular model, and these viewports have not been updated. So what I want to do is select this viewport and change the layer visibilities first. And what I'm looking to see is only my X and Y here. So I'm going to turn off all of the other objects, and I'm just looking for my bench generic solid in the Y direction and my bench generic solid in the X direction. So when I update that particular viewport, we should see here momentarily that that is the object we were looking at. Well, we'll also see here on my sheet that I've created section lines through all of these, and I didn't spend a lot of time making this look pretty, but you could essentially dimension these if you'd like and clean up the notes, etc., to give a nice quick representation of your product before you were to manufacture it. But this gives you a good idea of what we're in pursuit of, and I can go ahead and update these particular viewports as well. I'm going to go ahead and just take a second to change the layer visibilities on these as well. So go ahead and turn everything off except for the bench X and Y, as we've done previously, and I'll update those. It'll take a couple seconds. My DPI is a little bit higher on this particular sheet than normal, but we'll see there that we have a top plan showing us our kind of waffle shape. Now, if I was concerned about comfort, I might actually reduce the space in between, but this is a relatively utilitarian product we have here. You see the front view there. A little bit of room for boots. If I had some taller boots or something like that, I might augment my design a little bit. But given the power of this tool and how quickly you can iterate, you can do that. You could spend, you know, another 20 minutes, for example, or maybe another hour at most, reformulating this particular object. Now, how do you get it out of the computer? That's really, I believe, why at least half of you showed up to this webinar today, is you're probably thinking, I've been drawing things in 3D in this computer forever, been hearing a lot about these 3D printers and laser cutters and CNC milling machines, but how do we get it out of the computer and out of those machines? It's a lot of fun. The technology is really pervasive. I mean, in the office that I'm in right now, we've got a few 3Ders. We don't have a CNC milling machine. That's really where I want to send this thing. Or I might just print out some templates and cut out each of those panels with a jigsaw, depending on how much time I have. So let me show you how I might pursue that. Well, just the jigsaw or CNC method, I've actually taken those sections or the section viewports that I had cut through the plan, create these sections of every panel, and we'll see that the particular sections are actually numbered. So we could put that number on those particular panels, and these are all of the panels that are in our Y direction. So we have about 7 of these, 7 objects there. Each one of these panels is accurate to the overall form. And if I switch to the X direction, we'll see the 9 panels, and they look quite a bit different because that is the X direction. That gives the bench its void in the center where you can store your boots or other objects. And so what would I do with these particular viewports here is I can use the export function to export this information to a CAD file. There's obviously a lot of other options that we can export to, but if I want to export to a DWG, that gives them the ability to actually send this information to a laser cutter or a CNC router that will cut these objects out to scale. Obviously, I can scale it at a later time given the overall sheet that I want to use, and I could lay it out. Essentially, one shortcut to use in Vectorworks is to create a sheet here rather than creating a sheet with what is a 24 by 36 currently. If you go to a new sheet and actually create well, I'm just going to leave it sheet 1 at this point, but if you go to page setup here, you would want to go, I know this is a little bit of a maze to get through here, but if you go to printer setup, then what we're looking to do is manage custom sizes. If you want to see how all of these panels actually lay out on a standard 4 by 8 piece of plywood, then you can essentially create a 4 by 8 sheet here in Vectorworks and lay out all of the viewports at a 1-to-1 scale within that one. So that is one way to pursue that. You could send that directly to a CAD file and then send that into a CNC router, or print out sections of that sheet on your plotter and use them as templates. You could essentially just tape down to your sheet of plywood and go at it with your jigsaw. So sometimes the most rapid way to fabricate in 3D is just to use the tools at hand, and one of those is Vectorworks, and the other ones might be the hand tools in your garage. So another way, you might be saying, well, what about all of the other ways to get this object out? You already have a 3D object. Why recreate the 3D object with a sense of 2D methods? And I understand that desire, and so I'm going to look at actually we're going to activate the bench layer here. And let's say that I didn't slice this particular object into panels, and I want to print this object just as it is. It might be a little bit more comfortable to sit on, and that would be a nice product. What you would want to do here in Vectorworks is select your design layer where this particular object is, and I have, we'll see here that I just have the 3D design layer with that unsegmented form selected there. Now what you can do is actually export that information. So you want to go to File, Export, and then you have an option of a variety of files here, but one of those in particular could be an STL file. And I'm not going to output it just yet because this might take a few minutes and I don't want to lose my operating system while we're on this phone call, but it is pretty sturdy. The nice thing about STL files and some of these other files is you can actually preview them now, at least in Mac OS, and I believe Windows has that support as well. A lot like a 3D PDF, when you export this, you can actually spin them around on your computer as a preview, but then you can send this directly to a 3D fabricator that has a larger 3D printing table that would be would be able to produce an object of this scale. So that's one important thing to discuss, is that you need to be aware of the scale that your 3D printer that you have sitting on your desk is able to print at, because obviously it would need to be about the size of a small table if it were to be able to print an object of this size. And that's why we're seeing a lot of 3D printed objects that are still small trinkets or game pieces or smaller objects overall. It's just because of the size of the 3D printers isn't quite there yet for home use or office use. But there are a lot of resources that do this professionally, and they have much larger printing beds, and you could essentially send this file to a lot of resources online that would be able to print these for you. And in a follow-up email to this webinar, I'd be happy to share some of those resources if you are interested. You do have access to my email address through this webinar. It is jacob@tangibly.com. You'll reach me directly if you have any questions about this, Vectorworks, how to produce something with subdivision modeling, or how to output something to 3D printer. I'm always up for the challenge. This is what I love to do. But saying that, I'd love to open it up to any particular questions you might have currently. So Barbara, do we have anything that's floating to the top right now?
Not yet, okay, but there's a lot of great feedback and everybody's thanking you for the great tips.
Excellent.
And so we'll leave a few seconds for everybody if they, if they want to communicate with us, if they have any further questions. I think there's no more excuse now. They can go and fabricate. That was great. how often do you really produce material and create your own objects, Jacob? That is my question.
This has been really, well, since I've left architecture school, I've never really just had the tools at grasp. And it's taken a few years for a lot of those tools to really be more available to the common crowd. And really that's anybody with a computer and internet access today. There's a lot of services now where you can just upload that information. I used to depend a lot on the laser cutter in the lab and the CNC cutter. And it was usually just reserved for small architectural models because, well, in grad school I had a limited budget, so I couldn't really buy a lot of materials to put on the object. And then usually it was at a smaller scale that was more of a model. Now it's still valuable for this particular scenario, but now I'm actually beginning to explore, especially now with the subdivision tool with Vectorworks, I'm beginning to explore, creating some small objects. And I did present a couple of those objects at the recent Vectorworks Design Summit in Chicago, and they were just you know, again, at small scale because they were relatively affordable to produce at that time. But I am actually getting excited about more real-life, full-scale objects, and I do expect to actually fabricate this bench, and I look forward to sharing a follow-up video, or maybe we can do a brief webinar on kind of lessons learned on that fabrication and what I learned with the tools and how easy it might have been, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't completely easy. Maybe there's still some headaches involved. So I look forward to exploring it even more.
Wow, that would be great, Jacob. I'll take you up on that. In the
Great.
meantime, we have a couple of questions. Can you imagine map as texture on final shape to simulate advertising or pattern material?
Sure. That is actually really capable. Vectorworks is capable of doing that through what I'm going to select here is the object, and we have a solid subtraction right now. So this is a solid object, and right now, as you may have noticed, I just have a generic color assigned to it. Well, I could assign an image texture of some sort. I can go over here to the object info palette on the right-hand side and select render. And rather than being assigned to the class texture, I can override that and assign a particular class. I mean a particular texture. Now I don't know exactly what I would want to assign to it, but you'll notice here that I've assigned a CMU texture. Now something to pay attention to is these the way that these primitives are created is your grid is a little bit stretched in some circumstances. So if I go here to a wireframe view of this object, we'll see that not all faces are equal. So therefore, on some surfaces, it does stretch that texture around. So maybe not appropriate for more rectilinear textures. But if I go back to OpenGL here and switch to something, let's say, for example, we could just give a grass shader to it. Well, of course, a Renderworks shader is not going to show up. Let's see here what I can assign. We can assign a metal to it if we'd like to. And obviously, we're just in OpenGL here, but if you put this into a viewport and rendered at a higher resolution, it's going to come out a lot smoother, a lot nicer. And the more continuous textures that you apply to it, it's going to come out a little bit better than the repeating patterns, for example. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes. How about specifically sponsor logos, for instance?
Oh, great. Yeah, that's a great question. So since we're here already, we've applied a texture, which might be desirable. But the one button you're going to want to look for in that scenario for your sponsor logos is the Add Decal button here, and that allows you to, well, you have to change the texture map type, which essentially just changes the orientation of that texture. But it allows you to import a decal or an image file, essentially. Any image you want. If you have your client's logo, you can import that image and assign it to that surface there. So yeah, that is definitely available. And this particular method is available on all 3D objects in Vectorworks, is applying a decal. It's a great way to, we go over this in some of our rendering courses, it's a great way to add things like water stains or mud splatters or logos, for example, but just adding more depth to the texture of your object. So I hope that answers your question a little bit better.
Cool. And what do we do to form the slots to join the X and the Y panels together?
Could you restate the question, please?
Sure. What do we do to form the slots to join the X and the Y panels together?
Okay. So what I did was essentially use generic solid. Let me back up just a little bit here to what we can see. What I believe your question is referring to is these two particular objects here. And that is a result of a void that I've created from a solid subtraction. So I actually started with, and I'm just going to go to an active only mode here so we can only see what I'm selecting, but what I started with was just a constraint. So that is the overall shape of the object. That those are the limits. But this is also a volume, right? This is an extrude, which can be used with other solids to create subtraction. Well, what I did was I created these two panels like this. Well, also what I had created previous to this, and I actually don't currently have because they're within this particular object. But this is a solid subtraction, and I'll explain that just a little bit more. We have taken that overall cube and essentially sliced holes through it because we want to take this solid subtraction and intersect it with the shape of the bench, right? So if I double click into the solid subtraction, you have the ability to edit solid subtractions after you've created them, unless you've already converted it into a generic solid. So I won't go too far down that pathway, but just want to demonstrate that if I select in here, I actually have, I'm using the B key to just X-ray through and see all the objects I have within the solid subtraction. We'll see essentially the voids that I want to create were 3D objects that I intersected, or I don't want to use the wrong term, that I subtracted from this overall object. So when I exit this solid subtraction, we'll see those voids there. I hope that explains it just a little bit more. I do want to show you that, you know, when I switch to the, so we're on the panels shape here, and if I switch to the panels X here, hopefully you'll notice that that is essentially those are the inverse of each other. So I took the subdivision primitive, converted it to a generic solid, and then placed both this particular object. So I said, I selected this object and said copy, so I'll go up to edit, copy. And then if I go back to something like the bench, for example, which the texture's not really mapped so nicely now, but we'll get the idea. If I have this particular object, well, if I select this, we'll see it's a solid subtraction as well, because sorry about that. It's a solid subtraction because I took the primitive and converted it to generic solid. So I know I'm hopping around just a little bit, but I just want to really drive this home. I've gone back to the design layer, which I duplicated and essentially parked down here and turned off. Because I wanted to preserve my primitive in this scenario, I might actually want to go back in and edit my particular object. Well, this is a subdivision object. I could edit that if I want to. But what I did was I took this particular object and I could convert it to a generic solid here or duplicate this design layer. But if you go up to modify, convert, so the object is selected, I would convert that to a generic solid. So I'm going to lose that primitive if I haven't already duplicated that design layer. Well, once that's a generic solid, I would paste in place the generic solid on the same layer as essentially, you know, this cheese grater, for lack of a better term, and create the solid subtraction that we see here. So that creates those individual panels. And so I would do that for both objects. And then if I want to merge those two design layers by copy and paste in place, then I would have all of those solid objects on the same design layer, and I could output that to my fabricator if I need to. So I hope that explained it. I know I jumped around a little bit there.
Yeah, that was it, Jacob. Yeah, and I don't think any more questions, so I'm getting ready to take the screen away from you and back to my slide. Here we go.
Well, thank you again for giving me some time, Barbara.
Oh,
and I appreciate everybody joining us from around the world.
No, Jacob, thank you for joining our team of excellence with our presenter. That's really great. And now go and fabricate, everybody. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to remind everyone to visit our page at novedge.com, where you can find the entire line of Vectorworks, all the products, and also the 3D mouse that Jacob was so kind to mention. And Novedge is the best way to buy design software online. And for information on the latest specials, new releases, join the Novedge network on Facebook, Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. And don't forget, the next week's webinar is about 2D drawing to BIM, the transition that you can do on Vectorworks. And Jonathan Pickup is presenting, speaking about presenters and their excellence. To rewatch today's webinar or previous ones, check out our Novedge YouTube and Vimeo channels, our webinar playlist as webinar for every software taste. Thanks again for joining us today, and thank you, Jacob and Tangibly. Looking forward to have you presenting again with us. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you again. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.